This year marks the 100th anniversary of the start of World War I. With first-hand memories of the conflict almost all gone, it's hard to appreciate the devastation wrought by the Great War. But a new exhibit at Harvard is attempting to do just that with a collection of World War I maps. WGBH News reporter Elizabeth Ross recently paid a visit.
Buried deep in the stacks of Harvard's Pusey Library sits one of the oldest map collections in North America. It's here that librarian Bonnie Burns found a gold mine of World War I treasure.
I've found in the stacks maps that show the World War I trenches at a very detailed scale, and they really speak to me. They show so much information about the trenches.
It's from this collection of original World War I maps that Burns created the exhibit, From the Alps to the Ocean, Maps of the Western Front. Each of the 30 or so maps focuses on the minutiae of combat.
They show the first line of defense, they show the secondary lines, they show the communications trenches that went from the first line to the second line. In some cases, they show the barbed wire.
But the centerpiece is this mammoth map showing the entire Western Front over 4 years. Working off 200 different maps, Burns and her team created it. A vivid ribbon cuts across France and Belgium. It shows every known trench from the war. The German are blue, the Allied red.
To see just how long the front was and how much digging had to be done and just how many trenches there were that these men were living in.
To understand who these men were, historian Richard Rubin tells me about some of the American veterans he met while researching his book, The Last of the Doughboys.
One of the very first people I interviewed was a man named J. Lawrence Moffett, who was born and raised in rural Connecticut and retired to Cape Cod in his 60s and was 106 when I first went and visited him there.
Corporal Moffett served in the U.S. Army's 26th Division, the famed Yankee Division. Rubin says the trenches Moffett knew looked nothing like those you see in historical dramas like Downton Abbey.
Just hold fast. Won't be long now.
The trenches were filthy places. In much of France, the water table was not very deep, and so they were always muddy. They were filled with rats and lice. They were just not a place that you wanted to be.
This past summer, Rubin visited France in search of traces of the Great War. The fields and forests are green again, but many trenches and pillboxes are still there, even unexploded shells.
They're places where people engaged in some of the most dramatic and traumatic experiences of their lives, and they changed them forever.
And Bonnie Burns wants her exhibit to change how we view the war to end all wars today.
It was a seminal event in the history of the world, and we should know more about it, and we should honor it more.
Elizabeth Ross, WGBH News.
So what is the legacy of the war to end all wars? That's something my next guest has written about extensively. WGBH News contributor Charlie Sennett is the author of The 11th Hour, a special report on the unlearned lessons of World War I. Welcome to you, Charlie.
Thanks,
You've become obsessed with this, I know, because you're traveling all over the world looking at it.
Yeah.
I have to say I was kind of naively unaware of how blithely America, Britain, France redrew all these countries all over Europe, all over the Balkans. We kind of, Iraq, we kind of arbitrarily made those countries, which is kind of part of the problem we're facing today.
It is. I mean, the lines that were shaped in the aftermath of World War I are lines that are still very much a part of the conflicts that we as journalists are covering all over the world. And that's why I wanted to go back to these conflicts I'd covered and look at them in the context of World War I, because I'm constantly lugging around these historical books
like
about this one about how World War I shaped the modern Middle East and how those lines that were sort of arrogantly and very often ignorantly drawn and that disregarded the Sunni, the Shia, the tribal divisions, the Kurdish.
Was some of that intentional?
I think it was convenience. I think the empires wanted to divide the world, and they began to draw lines that fit their very practical needs. The very famous lines were drawn by Sykes-Picot. This is the very famous 1916 agreement where
a British and a
French diplomat, so the Britishman Sykes and the Frenchman Georges Picot, they actually literally divided up the world. So when they won the war, they were getting a little ahead of themselves because they hadn't won it yet, but they figured when they did win it, they would have spheres of influence. And they began to draw these lines. The British, very aware of the oil that was beginning to become a very important factor in the Middle East, so they sort of extended the boundary for Iraq, which would be under British control, around Mosul, disregarding the fact that they were blending Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish populations, not to mention different tribal structures and different religious minorities that existed within those sort of micro fissures of different cultures. All of that ignored in the creation of these modern states. And then along comes Wilson with his idea of nations, and of saying that we have to have the idea of these nations should be able to define their own path, right? This was the birth of nations. But this is a very modern concept. Those lines drawn in the sand in the Middle East are falling apart right now. And I've just returned from Iraq, where you could physically see that. You could see the Islamic State pushing across the boundaries established in World War I between Syria and Iraq. And as they were doing this invasion over the summer, Islamic State was live tweeting their invasion from the Syrian areas where they had been operating into the Iraqi areas where they've created what they call a caliphate. And they were live tweeting under the hashtag #SykesPicoOver.
Wow.
So they are very aware of this history.
Well, some of these other lines have gone away. Yugoslavia, I mean, a lot of the countries in the parameters, I mean, what is your lesson tell you, that some of them should be redrawn?
I don't know if there's a lesson that they should be redrawn, but certainly this summer, being there, right in the whole mix of the Balkans, and in Sarajevo, on the bridge where the famous assassination of Archduke Ferdinand happens in 1914, June 28th. That starts the war. I was there on the bridge this summer, literally receiving those live tweets from the Islamic State saying Sykes-Picot is over.
Oh my God.
and having this moment of history and the modern context in which we as reporters are trying to explain these things, and realizing this history really matters. Now in the Balkans, I covered the war in Kosovo, I covered the war in the Balkans, and we know that those dormant nationalisms, Serbian nationalism, which ignited World War I, right? It was a Serbian nationalist who is the assassin of Archduke Ferdinand. Those nationalisms are still smoldering. Those tensions are still there in the Balkans, in Sarajevo. And I think, rather than thinking about redrawing the lines, I think it's very relevant to think about how many of the issues of dormant nationalisms that were alive in World War I are still present today. And that the arrogance of those big Western powers to think that we can somehow create lines for our own convenience or uphold governments that we think are right. That's the lesson to be learned, I think, not to be arrogant and not to be unaware of the complexity of these lands that are now so much roiling with conflict.
Why didn't World War II blow up more of those definitions than it did?
That's a good question, and there'll probably be historians who could answer that better than I could. But my understanding of it would be that World War I was a time very much like our own. It was a multipolar world. This book is by Christopher Clark, and he's written this amazing book called The Sleepwalkers, where he makes the argument that what was happening in World War I is very much like today, a multipolar world of empires rising and falling. There is no clear definition in the world, and we have to have an understanding that when that happens, that's when nationalisms that were maybe once dormant start to rise up. The unresolved conflict of the, quote, war to end all wars ended with what they call the peace to end all peace, which is often understood, even those of us who only took history in college, right? you know that World War I paved the path to World War II, that Germany was punished too harshly for the war. They were left in an economic collapse, and they sought revenge. They wanted to bring their power back. And that has much to do with the Germans' resurgence and their real full frontal assault into Europe for World War II. So World War II is the unresolved conflicts of World War I exploding again. But World War II, as we know, ends with a dramatic division that is bipolar, which is the Soviet Union and the United States and its Western allies. And that bipolar world ended, as we know, when the wall came down in 1989 and into 91. big, long process. But what we're seeing now is a sort of return to that multipolar world. Russia's trying to reassert itself. Many would argue the U.S. empire is declining and waning in its influence. China is rising. Turkey, the former Ottoman Empire, so important in World War I, is reasserting itself in very strange and interesting ways. I think we need to try to understand the history to understand the moment we live in.
I have a feeling over the next 4 years we're going to be hearing a lot more about this, because leading up to November 11th, 11/11.
Right, on the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour, the war ended.
All right, Charlie
That's right.
Sennett, always a pleasure to have you.